I sat alone in the dark, gripping the edge of the kitchen table. The only sound in the room, the relentless ticking of the wall clock. It was almost midnight, and Sarah still wasn't home. My phone was right in front of me, the screen dimly glowing, displaying a single message. One message from a number I didn't recognize, but it told me everything I needed to know. She's with him right now. I stared at those words, my mind a mixture of fury and cold calculation. For months, I had known something was off. The late nights, the excuses, the way she turned her phone screen away from me whenever a message came through. Every alarm bell in my head had been ringing, but I hadn't wanted to believe it. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that I was reading too much into things. But now, all those doubts had been laid to rest by one text. Sarah was cheating on me. I thought back to the way things used to be when we first got married, when life felt simple. We had our struggles like any couple, but we always found a way to make things work. Or at least, that's what I thought. I had confronted her once, maybe 6 weeks ago. I asked her straight up if something was going on. She looked me dead in the eye, without flinching, and said no. She told me I was overreacting, that I was working too much and imagining things. For a second, I had almost believed her. I had wanted to believe her so badly. But now, that lie was dead, and something darker was starting to take its place. I didn't want to scream, didn't want to cry. No, I wanted revenge. Something that would make her regret every single choice she had made behind my back. I wasn't going to lash out in a rage. No, what I had in mind was far worse. I stood up from the table, grabbed the phone, and slipped into the office. The light from my computer monitor flickered on, casting a cold glow across the room. I logged into our bank accounts, scanned through the investments we had made over the years. Stocks, savings, a joint brokerage account. Sarah never really paid attention to the details. She always left the finances to me. I smiled as I moved a few things around, transferring some funds into an account she didn't know about, redirecting a few investments to make them look less profitable. Nothing too obvious, just a slow erosion of her financial security. By the time she noticed, it'd be too late. That was just the beginning. The next morning, Sarah came home around 7 a.m., wearing the same clothes she had left in. Her hair was a mess, and her eyes were bloodshot, but she tried to play it off like nothing was wrong. "Hey, sorry I'm late. Got caught up at work," she said, her voice casual as she tossed her bag onto the couch. I didn't say a word, just stared at her, giving a small nod. She didn't even notice my silence, didn't ask why I wasn't pushing for details. I think part of her had gotten comfortable with the lies, thought she had me under control, that I'd just accept whatever excuse she threw my way. But now I knew better. I watched her head upstairs, probably to shower off the night, while I calmly sipped my coffee at the kitchen table. Part of me wanted to follow her, to confront her right then and there, but I held back. I had to stick to the plan. It had to be slow, deliberate. I wasn't just going to expose her affair. I was going to dismantle everything. That afternoon, while she was at work, I started making the second move. I logged into her email and social media accounts. Sarah had always been careless with passwords, using the same ones for years. It took me no time to get in. I spent hours going through her messages, learning more about the man she was seeing. His name was Chris, and apparently, he worked in her office. I found messages between them, buried deep in her inbox, spanning months. They weren't just talking about sex, although there was plenty of that. They talked about their plans, their future. It made me sick to read it, but it also gave me exactly what I needed. I started planting seeds. First, I sent a message from Sarah's account to one of her colleagues, a vague, passive-aggressive email that hinted at frustration with the project. Nothing too serious, just enough to cause a little tension. Then I drafted a reply to Chris, making it look like she was having second thoughts about their little affair. Just enough to make him uneasy, to push him away a little. I wasn't going to let them enjoy this. No, I wanted to watch their relationship slowly disintegrate under the weight of doubt and suspicion. By the time Sarah got home that evening, she had no idea what I had set in motion. She walked in, smiling like nothing had changed, asked how my day was. I smiled back, just as calm as ever. "Great day, actually. How about you?" I said, watching her closely. "It was fine," she said, shrugging as she busied herself with dinner. But I saw it. The brief hesitation, the flicker of discomfort in her eyes when she said fine. She was starting to feel it, that subtle shift in her world. I went to bed early that night, leaving her downstairs with her phone and her secrets. Let her stew in it. This was only the beginning. Over the next week, things started to unravel for Sarah in small, almost imperceptible ways. She didn't seem to notice at first, too wrapped up in her affair to realize that I was slowly tugging at the threads of her life. I watched as she texted Chris, their messages becoming more guarded, more strained. My fake reply had clearly worked. Chris was pulling away, just as I'd planned. "Why are you being so distant?" she asked him one night, her voice low as she sat in the living room, her back to me. I was pretending to watch TV, but I heard everything. "Work's been stressful. Maybe we should slow things down," he said, his voice coming through the phone just loud enough for me to catch the hesitation. I smirked to myself. It was perfect. She was losing him, and she didn't even know why. At the same time, I kept playing with her career. The email I'd sent to her colleague had started a ripple effect. Her work was suffering, but not in an obvious way. There were missed deadlines, subtle mistakes that made her look careless. I started feeding her incorrect information about projects, making sure she looked like she wasn't on top of things. It didn't take long for the first complaints to roll in. One night, as we sat at dinner, she let out a frustrated sigh, pushing her food around her plate. "Everything okay?" I asked, feigning concern. "Just work. I don't know, I feel like nothing's going right lately. Projects are getting delayed. My boss has been giving me weird looks all week." "I don't get it." She shook her head, biting her lip in frustration. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. "Maybe you're just stressed. Maybe it's affecting your focus," I suggested, watching her closely. She didn't respond, just nodded absently. I knew the pressure was building. I wanted her to feel like everything in her life was slipping out of control, to make her doubt herself at every turn. It was working. She looked more tired, more anxious every day. She spent less time texting Chris, and when she did, it was short, clipped replies. He was pulling away faster now, and I could tell it was eating at her. But it wasn't enough yet. I wasn't just going to take away her relationship and her job. I was going to isolate her completely. That weekend, I dropped a few subtle comments to her closest friends. We were at a small get-together, just a few couples from the neighborhood. Over drinks, I casually mentioned that Sarah had been working a lot of late nights, how I barely saw her anymore, how she seemed distant. "I don't know," I said, leaning in a little closer to Karen, one of Sarah's closest friends. "Maybe she's going through something. She's been really stressed lately." Karen frowned, glancing over at Sarah, who was laughing with a few others across the room. "Yeah, I've noticed she's been a little off lately. Maybe I'll check in with her." I smiled inwardly. That's exactly what I wanted. Little whispers, little seeds of doubt. It wouldn't take long for her friends to start wondering what was really going on with her, to pull away from her just enough to make her feel even more isolated. By the time we got home that night, Sarah seemed distracted. She barely spoke to me, just went straight to bed without a word. I lay there next to her, feeling the gap between us grow wider by the minute, and I couldn't help but feel satisfied. She was unraveling, and I was the one holding the strings. The next few weeks were like watching a slow-motion car crash, and I was the one controlling the steering wheel. Sarah's life was crumbling piece by piece, and she had no idea I was behind it all. She was starting to lose control, and it showed in everything she did. Her job was the first to take a hit. The subtle mistakes I'd orchestrated began piling up, and it wasn't long before she got called into her boss's office. I knew it was coming because I'd been careful, feeding her just enough wrong information to sabotage her without making it obvious. One evening, she came home later than usual, her face pale, her lips pressed tight. "What happened?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though I knew exactly what had gone down. "I don't know," she said, shaking her head, her voice shaky. "My boss pulled me in his office today. He said there have been complaints about my work, that I'm missing deadlines and not paying attention. But I swear, I've been doing everything right." I nodded, trying to look sympathetic. "Maybe you're just stressed. You've been working a lot of late nights." She shot me a sharp glance at the mention of her late nights, but I didn't push it. "Not yet. Let her stew on that." Instead, I continued, Maybe you just need to take a step back. Get some rest. Things will look clearer. Maybe, she muttered, though I could see the doubt in her eyes. She was losing her grip at work, and it was starting to spill over into everything else. Her friendships were next. Karen, who had once been Sarah's closest confidant, had grown distant. I had planted enough doubt during our conversations that Karen wasn't sure what to believe anymore. I overheard Sarah on the phone with her one evening. "Are we still on for brunch this Sunday?" Sarah asked, her voice hopeful. There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost hear Karen making an excuse. Sarah's shoulders slumped. "Oh, I see. No, it's fine. We'll reschedule." She hung up, staring at her phone for a moment, and then tossed it on the couch with a frustrated sigh. "What's wrong?" I asked, though I already knew. "Karen's bailing on brunch," she said. "She's been acting weird lately. I don't know what her problem is." I didn't say anything, just let her frustration linger. That's exactly what I wanted. Slowly, her support system was beginning to fracture. The people she relied on, the ones who made her feel secure, were slipping away, leaving her with fewer places to turn. As for Chris, I could see that their affair was on its last legs. He wasn't as responsive as he had been, and the brief conversations they did have were strained, awkward. Sarah seemed more and more anxious every time she tried to reach out to him. One night, I watched her stare at her phone for a long time, her thumb hovering over the screen before she finally set it down with a sigh. That was when I knew it was time to tighten the noose. I decided it was time to take things a step further. I had already rattled her work and strained her friendships, and her affair with Chris was crumbling. But I wanted to make sure she felt trapped, like the walls were closing in from all sides. That night, as she lay in bed beside me, her breathing slow and steady in sleep, I quietly slipped out of the room. I went into my office and pulled up our shared bank accounts. Sarah had never been good with money. She left the financial decisions to me, trusting that I had our best interests at heart. Little did she know I'd been making moves for weeks, redirecting our investments, pulling money into an account she had no access to, one that only I controlled. Now, I took it further. I started pulling larger sums, moving them into a separate offshore account. She wouldn't notice right away. It would take a few months for it to really sink in. By the time she realized she was nearly broke, it would be too late. I smiled as I made the last transfer, imagining the panic that would set in once she figured it out. But I had to play the long game, let her feel like she was still in control for now. The next morning, she left for work in a rush, not even bothering to say goodbye. She had been distant lately, her frustration palpable. I didn't mind. I knew what was coming next. That afternoon, I sent an anonymous tip to her company's HR department. Nothing too direct, just enough to raise suspicion. I made it sound like Sarah had been leaking confidential information to competitors, subtly implying that her late nights and secretive behavior were tied to something more than just work. I knew they'd investigate. Sarah wouldn't be able to explain it, not with her recent string of mistakes. I wanted her to feel paranoid, to start doubting everyone around her, thinking that her downfall was just a series of unfortunate events. That evening, when she came home, she was quieter than usual. She barely ate, pushing her food around on her plate. "Rough day?" I asked, playing the concerned husband. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, there's been some stuff going on at work. HR pulled me in for a meeting today. Someone reported me for something I didn't do. I don't know what's happening." Her voice was shaky, her confidence slipping. I could tell she was close to breaking. "That's strange," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Maybe it's just a misunderstanding." "Maybe," she muttered, but the doubt was clear in her eyes. I could feel the satisfaction building inside me, but I kept my face calm. She was falling apart, and it was exactly what I wanted. But I wasn't finished. The biggest blow was still coming. The next day, I sent Chris an anonymous message. I kept it vague but menacing, just enough to make him second-guess everything about his relationship with Sarah. "She's using you. Be careful who you trust." I knew Chris was already pulling away, and this would be the final push. I wanted to make sure that when Sarah lost him, she wouldn't even know why. She'd be left standing in the wreckage of her life, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. By the end of the week, the cracks were becoming impossible for Sarah to ignore. The carefully curated life she thought she had was starting to disintegrate before her eyes, and I made sure to keep the pressure on. Every time I saw that flicker of anxiety in her eyes, I knew my plan was working. That Friday, she came home late again, but this time she wasn't trying to hide it. There was no excuse about work or a rushed apology. She just walked in, dropped her bag on the floor, and sank into the couch, staring blankly at the wall. Her phone buzzed beside her, but she didn't pick it up. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, pretending to focus on the TV, but I could tell something had shifted. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. She sighed heavily, rubbing her temples. "No, not really. What's going on?" I pressed gently, knowing exactly where this was headed. "Chris, he's been acting weird," she said, her voice soft, almost fragile. "He barely talks to me anymore, and when he does, it's like he's distant. I think something's wrong." I bit back a smile. The message I sent him must have done its job. He was pulling away faster than I'd expected. Maybe he's stressed out. "Have you asked him about it?" "I tried," she muttered, shaking her head. "But it feels like he's slipping away." "Maybe you should let him," I said, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them. She looked at me, startled by my bluntness. "What?" I shrugged, keeping my tone even. "I mean, if it's not working out, maybe it's a sign. Maybe it's not meant to be." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought she might finally crack, finally admit what I had known all along. But instead, she just blinked, swallowing hard as if trying to keep herself together. "I don't know," she whispered, looking down at her hands. The silence that hung between us was thick, charged with everything that wasn't being said. I could feel her teetering on the edge, but she wasn't quite ready to fall. Not yet. That night, while she slept, I logged back into her accounts. The tension between her and Chris was undeniable. Their texts had become short, clipped exchanges, far from the flirtatious messages I'd found weeks ago. I decided to make it worse. I sent a message from Sarah's phone to Chris, making it look like she was ending things. "This isn't working anymore. I can't keep doing this." It was perfect, just enough to make him back off completely. By morning, the message would be sent, and Chris would be gone from her life for good. The next day, everything began to unravel. Sarah checked her phone during breakfast, and I saw the color drain from her face as she read Chris's reply. "I thought we had something, but I guess I was wrong. Goodbye." Her hands trembled as she put the phone down, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. She didn't say a word, just stared blankly at the table, her mind reeling. I watched her from across the room, keeping my expression neutral, but inside, I felt a cold satisfaction. Chris was out of the picture. Her career was crumbling. Her friendships were strained. She had no idea what was happening or why everything in her life was collapsing. She was at the breaking point, and I was the one who had pushed her there. Sarah didn't say much that weekend. She moved through the house like a ghost, her usual energy and confidence completely drained. I could tell the weight of everything was starting to crush her, but I wasn't done yet. I had one more thing to take from her, her self-respect. That Monday morning, she left for work with a strained smile, trying to act like things were normal. I watched her walk out the door, knowing she had no idea what was waiting for her at the office. She thought she was barely holding on, but today would be the final push over the edge. Later that afternoon, I got the call I had been waiting for. Sarah was being called into a disciplinary meeting at work. The anonymous tip I had sent to HR about her leaking confidential information had triggered an internal investigation. The mistakes I'd manipulated her into making over the past few weeks made her look guilty, careless, and incompetent. Her boss and HR weren't sure what to believe anymore, and now she was being asked to account for herself. I imagined her sitting in that sterile conference room, her heart pounding as she tried to defend herself, tried to explain how things had spiraled out of control. I could picture the way her boss would look at her, with disappointment and suspicion. No matter what she said, it wouldn't matter. The damage was done. I made sure of that. By the time she came home that night, I knew she'd be completely broken. She walked through the door just after 7 p.m., her eyes red from crying, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She didn't even bother to say hello, just dropped her bag on the floor and went straight to the bedroom. I waited a moment before following her. When I walked into the room, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands. She didn't look up when I came in. Rough day? I asked, leaning against the doorway. Her laugh was hollow, bitter. You could say that. I walked over and sat beside her, keeping my tone calm. What happened? She took a deep breath, then let it out slowly, her voice shaking as she spoke. HR pulled me into a meeting today. They said there's been an investigation, something about me leaking information. They think I've been making mistakes on purpose, that I'm sabotaging my own work. She shook her head, her hands trembling. I don't understand how this is happening. I swear I've been trying, Mike. I've been trying so hard, but everything's falling apart. I looked at her, my face carefully blank. Maybe it's just a rough patch. Things will turn around. She shook her head again, tears welling up in her eyes. I don't think so. I don't know if I can fix this. She was right. She couldn't fix it because I had made sure of that. Her career was on the brink of collapse, and soon, her financial security would follow. But instead of feeling satisfied, I felt nothing. As I watched her break down, the victory I had imagined didn't taste as sweet as I thought it would. The plan was working perfectly, but something was missing. Sarah wiped her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. I don't even have Chris anymore. She looked up at me, and for a brief second, I thought she might confess. That she might tell me about the affair, finally lay it all out in the open. But then she closed her eyes, shaking her head. I feel like I'm losing everything. I didn't say anything. I just watched as the woman I once loved sat there, broken, the pieces of her life scattered around her. And even though I was the one who had destroyed it all, I felt strangely detached, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. The days following Sarah's breakdown were eerily quiet. She went through the motions of everyday life, but she wasn't really present anymore. The vibrant, confident woman I had married was gone, replaced by someone who was barely holding herself together. I could see the cracks deepening, her mind racing to make sense of why everything in her life was falling apart. And I was the one holding the last piece. One evening, about a week later, I saw my opportunity to deliver the final blow. Sarah had retreated to the bedroom after another long day at work, her eyes hollow and distant. I waited until she was out of earshot before I grabbed my phone and made the last move in my plan. I texted her boss anonymously, using a burner number. It was simple but devastating. You might want to look into Sarah's relationship with Chris. It's more than just professional. I knew they were already watching her closely, already suspicious because of the leaked information and her recent mistakes. This would push them over the edge. In her corporate world, a workplace affair could be the final nail in the coffin. The next day, Sarah left for work without a word, her usual forced smile barely holding up. I spent the day waiting for her to come home, knowing that when she did, everything would have changed. That evening, the front door creaked open slowly. I didn't even have to look up to know it was her. Her footsteps were heavy, like each one took effort. And when she finally stepped into the living room, she looked like she had been through hell. They fired me, she said, her voice flat, almost robotic. I looked up from my book, feigning surprise. What? Why? She collapsed onto the couch, her hands trembling in her lap. They found out about Chris. Her voice broke on his name. Someone told them. I don't even know how they knew, but they brought it up in the meeting today. I couldn't deny it. I tried to explain, but it didn't matter. They said it violated company policy, that they couldn't trust me anymore. I'm done. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing, and I watched her with a cold sense of satisfaction. I had taken everything from her, her job, her affair, her reputation. She had no one left. You should have told me, I said quietly, my voice steady. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide, red from crying. What? I've known about Chris for a while, I said, leaning back in my chair, watching her closely. The late nights, the lying, it wasn't hard to figure out. She stared at me, her face pale, her mouth opening and closing like she didn't know what to say. I'm not an idiot, Sarah. I've been watching everything. You've been with him for months, haven't you? She stammered, her eyes filling with panic. Mike, I'm so sorry. I didn't. Save it. I snapped, cutting her off. I don't want to hear your excuses. I've been sitting here, watching you lie to my face for months, pretending everything was fine. And all this time, you've been screwing some guy behind my back. Her shoulders shook as she sobbed harder. and for a moment, I almost felt pity for her. Almost. But I didn't let myself soften. This was what she deserved. I lost everything because of him, she whispered through her tears. And now I've lost you too. I stood up, my voice cold. You've lost more than just me, Sarah. You've lost your job, your friends, your respect. Everything you thought you had, it's gone. And you have no one to blame but yourself. She crumbled into herself, her sobs filling the room. But I didn't feel anything. Not anger, not satisfaction, just emptiness. I had spent so much time plotting my revenge, so much time tearing her life apart, that now, standing over her, I wasn't sure what came next. Without another word, I walked out of the room, leaving her alone in her misery. The days following Sarah's firing were marked by silence. She barely left the house, her once vibrant personality reduced to a shell of itself. I'd see her sitting by the window, staring out blankly, lost in her own world of shame and regret. It should have felt like victory. I had broken her, taken everything she had built, and turned it to dust. But something gnawed at me, something I hadn't accounted for. One night, while Sarah was asleep, I sat in the office, scrolling through the last remnants of my revenge plan. Bank accounts drained, her reputation at work destroyed, her affair ruined. Yet, as I went over each victory, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It wasn't enough. I had thought revenge would bring closure, but instead, I felt nothing but emptiness. That's when I saw it. An email notification from Chris, buried in Sarah's inbox, unopened. I hesitated for a moment before clicking on it, not expecting much. But what I read changed everything. Sarah, I can't keep this up anymore. This wasn't what we agreed to. You said this would be over months ago, and now everything is falling apart. I've lost my job, my family is suspicious, and now they're coming after me. You promised this would be done quickly, but I'm starting to think you never had control of the situation. You need to fix this, or we're both going to pay for it. I sat there, rereading the message, trying to make sense of it. Chris had lost his job? And what did he mean by what we agreed to? I thought I knew the whole story. I thought Sarah had just been cheating, and I was punishing her for it. But now, it seemed like there was something much bigger happening, something I hadn't considered. Curiosity got the better of me. I began searching through her emails, looking for more clues. After hours of sifting through old messages, I found a thread of conversations between Sarah and Chris that went back almost a year. At first, it was nothing, just harmless flirtation. But as I read further, I realized this wasn't just an affair. Sarah and Chris had been involved in something much darker. It wasn't love or desire that brought them together. It was blackmail. They had been leaking sensitive information from Sarah's company to a competitor, using her position at work to sabotage her own projects. It was a way to cover their tracks, make it look like her performance was slipping naturally, all while Chris handled the dirty work on the other end. The worst part? Sarah wasn't even the one in control. She had been manipulated, drawn into this mess by Chris, who had promised her it would be quick, easy money. But as time went on, it spiraled out of control. The blackmail turned into a tangled web, and now, with Chris pulling away and the pressure mounting, Sarah had no way out. I sat back in my chair, stunned. My plan to destroy Sarah's life had worked, but I hadn't realized just how much danger she was actually in. This wasn't just about an affair. She was caught up in something far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. And now it was too late to stop it. For days, I wrestled with the new information. The woman I had spent months dismantling wasn't just a cheater. She was a victim, dragged into a scheme she didn't know how to escape. My cold plan for revenge now seemed trivial compared to the disaster that was looming over both of us. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table in near silence, I looked at Sarah. Her face was drawn, her eyes hollow. She barely touched her food. I hadn't told her what I'd uncovered, but I knew it was time. Sarah, I said, breaking the silence, there's something we need to talk about. She looked up at me, confused. What is it? I know about Chris. I know about the blackmail. Her face drained of color, and she stared at me, her mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. I found the emails. I continued. I know everything. The leaks, the sabotage, the reason your career's been falling apart. I know Chris set you up. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head. Mike, I didn't want this. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I leaned back in my chair, the anger I'd held on to for so long fading into something else. Pity, maybe. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you come to me when this started? She wiped her eyes, her voice cracking. Because I thought I could fix it. Chris told me it was just a one-time thing, that we'd make some quick money and move on, but it got out of control. And by the time I realized what I'd gotten into, it was too late. I didn't know how to get out. And now? I asked, my voice low. She looked at me, the guilt written all over her face. Now I'm trapped. Chris has been pulling away. I think he's scared, and I'm scared too. If the company finds out what I've done, they already know, I said bluntly. I made sure of that. She stared at me in disbelief, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out. But instead, she broke down, sobbing into her hands. Why? Why did you do this? Because I thought you were just having an affair, I said, my voice tight. I didn't know about all of this. I wanted to punish you for betraying me. But now, I don't know what happens next. For a long time, the room was silent, save for Sarah's soft sobbing. I had spent months plotting my revenge, never realizing how deep the rabbit hole went. Now, the woman I had destroyed was facing more than just a ruined career and reputation. She was facing potential prison time, financial ruin, and the collapse of her entire life. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with the weight of everything I had learned. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had two options. I could let Sarah's world continue to crumble, let her pay the price for everything she had done, or I could try to help her. Helping her wasn't something I had ever considered. For months, I had wanted nothing but to see her suffer, to feel the same betrayal and heartbreak I had felt. But now, knowing the full story, revenge didn't feel as satisfying. It felt hollow, empty. I didn't know if I could live with myself, knowing I had left her to face this alone. By morning, I had made my decision. I found Sarah in the kitchen, her eyes red and puffy from crying all night. She looked up at me, wary, as if she didn't know what to expect. I think we need to fix this, I said quietly. She blinked, confused. What do you mean? I mean, we need to figure out how to get you out of this mess. I've already done enough damage. Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time, it wasn't out of fear or sorrow. It was relief. She nodded, her voice shaky. I don't know how to fix it. We'll start with Chris, I said. We need to cut him off, make sure he can't drag you down with him. Then we'll talk to a lawyer, figure out the best way to handle this with your company. You're not going to prison, Sarah. Not for this. She stared at me for a long moment, her lip trembling. Why are you helping me? After everything, why? I didn't have a good answer. Maybe I was doing it out of guilt. Maybe I couldn't bear the thought of completely destroying her, knowing she had already been manipulated. Or maybe, deep down, there was still a part of me that remembered the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. I don't know, I admitted, but I'm not going to let this destroy both of us. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and I worked together, as strange as that felt. We cut ties with Chris, making sure he couldn't use Sarah to cover his own tracks anymore. We spoke to a lawyer who helped us navigate the legal fallout of what Sarah had done. It wasn't easy, but it was better than prison. Through it all, something between us shifted. I didn't forgive her. Not fully, but I began to understand her. The anger I had felt for so long started to fade, replaced by a strange sense of peace. She had made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but so had I. My revenge had been cruel, calculated, and in the end, it hadn't brought me the satisfaction I thought it would. If anything, it had only deepened the wounds. Sarah lost her job, her reputation in the corporate world destroyed. But we managed to keep her out of jail. It took everything we had to rebuild our lives financially and emotionally. And even though we worked together to fix things, our marriage was never the same. The trust was gone, and without it, there was no real foundation left. Eventually, we divorced. It wasn't messy or bitter, just the quiet end to a relationship that had already been broken.